Hi, and welcome to Rontime. Today would be the 18th of July, 2014. This will be Rontime number 19 for those of you that can count that high. Today, first of all, again, I'd like to focus on those who have flown west, as they say in TWA, those who have passed on to another era. And there are 250 passengers on a Malaysian airline flight that was shot down by Russian missile over the Ukraine. And both sides are blaming each other. And no one wants to admit where the black boxes are that contain the information of the flight recorder and the flight data recorder. So it's going to be interesting to see if an impartial and scientifically accurate team of investigators is going to be allowed to determine the fate of Flight 17. It's also a good time to recall from looking behind me that the monsoons have finally come to Arizona, to southern Arizona and Tucson, and that the rain that we've had in the past few days have brought us an incredible blessing to the desert, much needed because of the extended drought here in the Southwest, which still exceeds 17 years of records for high temperature and low rainfall. And because we're in July, then we actually get to begin to eventually honor the Leos. And this portion of the astrological chart, two of my ex-wives are Leos. Their role as lionesses in my life, I would wish to acknowledge and learn to appreciate over time. Being a double Gemini, life's kind of interesting. It happens to us, and it occurs to us because double Geminis are kind of open. In fact, they're more than kind of open. They're very open. And as we move from the moon child in this part of July into the Leo in the end of July, I want to acknowledge the power of the Leo as leaders and organizers, and in my case, co-producers, because I was able to do a lot with both of my Leo wives that I probably was not prepared to do alone. Moving to foreign countries, taking assignments overseas, being willing to uproot, sell our businesses and move. And so here we are in a time of great movement of water through the desert and water into the earth again in this part of the world. And again, I'm reminded that years ago I had this dream about being able to float down the Santa Cruz River all the way to the confluence of the lower Salt, the lower Colorado, and out into the Sea of Cortez. Something which only recently has been reoccurring, where water flows all the way through the delta, clear out to the Sea of Cortez, because for the first time in years and years, the dams on the lower Colorado that normally divert all of the remaining waters to the Pan American Canal, which runs across Southern California and feeds parts of Los Angeles with water from the Colorado River. I'm reminded that for the first time in a long time, those dams were technically breached, and the confluence of the Colorado River was allowed to reach all the way down into the Sea of Cortez. That's the work of the effort of tons of organizations and a bunch of very dedicated individuals who actually saw the return of the Delta as an opportunity for reforestation of mangroves, for reestablishment of channels and island systems with ecosystems that support all kinds of wildlife, migratory birds, fish species, baby shrimps, everything that makes the Sea of Cortez the third most biodiverse region of all the oceans on Earth. And because of that confluence of waters at an extreme high tide, they didn't actually meet at the Sea of Cortez. They met miles inland north of the Sea of Cortez because of this record high tide. And what that did then was to show the scientists who had worked on these projects for years and years in the planning phases that it was well worth the expense, the time, the effort, the political wrangling, the lobbying that had to take place, and the mitigation between states over the rights of water in the Colorado River. And we finally, therefore, fulfilled our treaty obligation to Mexico by allowing water to flow from the Colorado freely to the Sea of Cortez. So a major milestone has occurred on the Colorado River, which allows that ecosystem to return to its full vibratory quality. And we will see over time the return of enormous numbers of migratory species to the wetlands and the restoration projects that are going on there. This month in July is also the anniversary of the quashing by the DEA, the Drug Enforcement Agency of the federal government of the United States of America, in subduing publication and actually placing gag orders on all the research scientists and physicians here at the University of Arizona who in 1983 proved beyond a shadow of the doubt that concentrated cannabinoid oils in the bloodstream killed all 3 forms of breast cancer without any negative side effects and without any form of the pain and suffering that's caused by chemotherapy and radiation treatments, the most popular treatments in the United States. And I wish to point out that if this has occurred ever since 1983, that the numbers are staggering. The numbers of American women who suffered from 3 different forms of breast cancer that could have been cured by a cannabinoid oil from a plant called cannabis, marijuana, which was made illegal through the use of a fraudulent artifice in the Congress of the United States in 1937 when Harry Anslinger testified that cannabis causes white women to want to dance with black men, Puerto Ricans, entertainers, and others. And if you don't believe what I'm saying, look up the 1937 Marijuana Tax Act, and you will see that that hearing was pushed behind closed doors and no testimony was allowed from the 3 doctors who were there to represent the American Medical Association to tell the truth about this cannabis drug. But instead, Harry Anslinger, a gentleman who, by the way, shaved his entire body, including his head, and was a white racist, white supremacist who believed that cannabis had to become enemy number 1 of the federal government in order for him to perform his God-given task as the head of the Federal Bureau of Narcotics. Now, please remember, this was the use of a fraudulent artifice before Congress, an elected body who is supposed to represent in a democracy the people from their districts and their beliefs, practices, and understanding of science and life as experienced here in America, one of the freest countries on earth. Well, ever since then, we've been engaged in the war on drugs that started to accelerate in the 70s when the Attica State Prison riots occurred and both prisoners and guards were killed, and the Rockefeller, governor of the state of New York, insisted on stiff mandatory sentencing for all kinds of forms of crime, including the possession and or sale and use of cannabis. And since then, this war on drugs has accelerated to the point where 5% of the world's population in the United States of America, a democracy with elected officials to Congress, now houses 25% of the world's prisoners, a higher percentage than any other country at any other period of history that we have written record for, including the gulags of Russia. It's really time to face the facts about our war on drugs and our policy on cannabis in the United States of America. Conservative estimates of annual government spending on the U.S. war on drugs is $51 billion. That's with the great big B, $51 billion annually. That's enough to send tens of thousands of accused cannabis criminals into rehabilitation and full educational programs. That's actually enough to give us enough college graduates at the undergraduate level to make up for the job deficit created by the Bush War and the Cheney War in Iraq, where they lied to us and told us that there was yellow cake and weapons of mass destruction. So it begins to show a repetitive pattern of where America, with its war on drugs and its stance in the world, has turned us into the largest facilitator of prisoner populations on earth. And it's not producing the desired effect. There is little or no decline on the available supply because those cartels and other organizations who bring drugs into the United States continue to develop more and more sophisticated technology and processing. They actually pay off more and more officials to look the other way. And at this point, the acceleration of the demand in the United States over the available supply from other countries is an indication that the way we set our policy and the beliefs that we have about people's use of cannabis are not based on fact and not based on science. But when you look at the federal government of the United States, there is so little that's based on fact and so little that's based on science, because the lobbyists on K Street are the one who are responsible for the creation and legislation that goes on in both houses of Congress, where in the Republican Party, their stated policy ever since a black man was elected president of the United States was to sit on everything, to do nothing, to try to freeze the government, to actually take away the operating capital of the daily operation of the United States government. In the state of Arizona, the sequester that was demanded by the Congress of the United States is estimated to have cost this state $27 million in losses in revenue and taxes during the federal shutdown. And these legislators who are elected to go to Congress and to represent us represent a larger proportion of millionaires and multimillionaires per capita than the entire population of the United States as a whole. So how can you expect multimillionaires and millionaires who are being lobbied by K Street lobby firms with practically unlimited budgets because of the ruling of the Supreme Court of the United States, which said that corporations have personhood and are therefore entitled to free speech at any and all price, regardless of its moral consequence. That in fact, legislation in the United States can be purchased by the highest bidder, regardless of whether it's good for democracy, whether it's good for Americans, whether it creates jobs, whether it solves our complex tax problems, and whether or not it begins to reduce the deficit, which, by the way, 82% of all deficits under the federal government were created under Republican administrations, and that the most recent balanced budget that ended up with a budget surplus was a president who was impeached for having a sexual affair with an aide in the White House. And yet, he's the one who reduced the deficit and it ended up giving us a surplus. Now, granted, this is not 1990s, and we don't have the tech bubble and the emergence of the tech market to push all these new jobs and create all these positions that were destroyed under the Bush-Cheney administration and then blamed on the Obama administration because they followed. So, if we continue to spend $51 billion a year arresting Americans every 37 seconds for cannabis, in no time at all, we will have a deficit created by housing prisoners. After all, I'd like to tell you what a few concerned Americans have said about this war on drugs. Jimmy Carter, the 39th President of the United States, that said, penalties for the possession of a drug should not be more damaging to an individual than the use of the drug itself. If you're arrested for cannabis in the city of Tucson and you have cannabis in your vehicle will be impounded and towed away. Your license will be suspended for driving under the influence, and you will owe the city court $1,450 fine for possession of cannabis. Now that could be a $20 bag of cannabis, but the fine is set at $1,450. And according to Arizona statutes, you can be placed in prison in this state for up to 3 years for your first offense of possession of marijuana. Please understand that these are in for-profit prisons where if they're not 90% occupied, you, the taxpayers of the state of Arizona, make up the difference to these for-profit, publicly held companies whose only job is the incarceration of prisoners. Please understand that our governor, Wacko Jan, is a shareholder in these corporations to whom she is personally responsible for sentencing over $1 million, over $10 million of Arizona taxpayer revenues were handed over, lock, stock, and barrel, to for-profit prison companies in Arizona to house prisoners from our state and other states when there were Arizona state-owned facilities available. And that's just last year. Since an American is arrested every 37 seconds, one would think that this would show up on the radar. Well, the reason that it doesn't show up on the radar is because most of the people arrested are people of color. And that in fact 4 out of 5 prisoners in America today are people of color. By the end of this decade, 1 in 3 black Americans will have either served prison time or have been convicted of a felony, including cannabis. 1 in 3. And when you look at the social implications of what happens to a society where 1/3 of the black male population has a criminal record associated with cannabis, then you'll understand, like me, that there are 5.5 million of us who cannot vote because we're cannabis criminals who are charged with felonies and have never had our rights restored. So, as you know from previous Ron times, I actually challenged the President of the United States to sign a proclamation making every April 20th Harry Anslinger Day, a day of national gardening for both hemp and cannabis across the United States, and to establish a process of truth and reconciliation to restore the civil rights of all people who are prosecuted under this statute because Harry Anslinger lied to the Congress. It is not a Class 1 narcotic. It does not deserve Class 1 status in our criminal justice system. And it certainly needs to be studied scientifically at all levels, because there is proof that the Drug Enforcement Administration quashed studies done scientifically at university-level research facilities that proves that it kills breast cancer in all 3 forms. Now, if this has been known since 1983, think of the number of women who have had to suffer the indignity of the way we treat breast cancer traditionally, with radiation bombardment, which kills all kinds of cells, sometimes the cancer, sometimes not, or chemotherapy, a system of literally taking the body close to death so that the cancer cells no longer survive. All of those women in all of that time could have been treated with a naturopathic, non-invasive, non-harmful, natural treatment. Why did this not occur? There appears to be a conspiracy between the federal government of the United States, the pharmaceutical companies, the tobacco industry, and the Drug Enforcement Agency that no one wants to stop playing this big money game at your expense. Nor are they willing to admit the truth that they quashed scientific evidence that concentrated cannabinoid oils kill all 3 forms of breast cancer. I'd like to put a big old shout out to Cicely at the University of Arizona. Doc, I'm so sorry you got fired for speaking up and telling the truth, but your research, which you were granted permission to do on university campuses, including the University of Arizona, will come back to you. Everything will come back to you tenfold. And the University of Arizona, the Drug Enforcement Administration, is going to have to lift the seals on these quashed studies and lift the gag orders on the scientists and doctors who conducted them, and we're going to tell the truth about breast cancer. I would like to thank all of you for taking the time to listen to Ron Time, to look at this show, to consider the facts as presented to you. Have a nice day.